I never expected that the hardest part of my divorce wouldn't be signing the papers, it would be running into my ex-husband at the mailbox every single morning. When David and I separated, I did what most people do after a marriage falls apart. I cried for weeks, I called my best friend at midnight more times than I can count, I rearranged every piece of furniture in the apartment because I needed everything to feel different, and then slowly, very slowly, I started to put myself back together. It took almost a full year. A year of therapy, of learning how to cook dinner for one, of figuring out who I was without the title of wife attached to my name. And by the time that year was over, I genuinely felt like I was in a different place. Calmer. Steadier. Ready for whatever came next. What came next was David. Not in the dramatic way, not a phone call, not a letter, not some grand gesture at my door. It was simpler and somehow much more disorienting than any of that. I was standing in the hallway of my new apartment building on a Tuesday afternoon, still holding a cardboard box I hadn't finished unpacking, when the elevator opened and he walked out pulling a suitcase behind him. We looked at each other for what felt like a very long time but was probably about 4 seconds, and then he said, "You have got to be kidding me." I had moved into the building 3 weeks earlier. He had apparently signed his lease 2 days after I did, without either of us knowing. The building manager later told us, with what I can only describe as deeply unfortunate enthusiasm, that we were on the same floor. Apartment 14 and apartment 17. 3 doors apart. I went back inside my apartment and sat on the kitchen floor for about 20 minutes. Let me give you some context, because this story doesn't make sense without it. David and I had been together for 9 years, married for 6 of them. We weren't a dramatic couple. We didn't scream or throw things or say the kinds of things you can never take back. What we were was 2 people who had slowly grown into completely different directions without noticing it was happening, and then one day woke up and looked at each other across the breakfast table and both knew, without saying a word, that something fundamental had changed. The divorce was mutual. The lawyers were calm. We divided everything fairly and with very little argument, and when it was over we shook hands in the parking lot of the courthouse like 2 colleagues who had just finished a difficult project together. I hadn't spoken to him since that parking lot. That was 14 months ago. And now he was in apartment 17. The first week was surreal in a way I don't have a better word for. We were polite. Almost painfully polite, the kind of polite that takes real effort, where you smile a little too wide and say good morning in a voice that's slightly too bright and then go inside and stand in your hallway wondering what just happened. We held the elevator for each other. We nodded in the laundry room. Once, on a Thursday evening, we ended up walking to the parking garage at exactly the same time and made small talk about the weather for 90 seconds that felt like 90 years. My friend Laura thought the whole situation was hilarious. She came over for wine that first weekend, sat on my couch, and laughed for a solid 3 minutes before she could compose herself enough to ask me how I was actually doing. I told her I was fine. She looked at me the way only a best friend can and said, "You are absolutely not fine." She wasn't wrong. Because the truth was that seeing David every day was doing something to me that I hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for. It wasn't that I still loved him, I had done enough therapy to understand that what I felt for him had transformed into something quieter and less urgent than love. It wasn't longing exactly. It was more like grief, but a specific kind of grief, the kind you feel not for a person but for a whole version of your life that used to exist and doesn't anymore. Every time I saw him in the hallway I was reminded of Sunday mornings and shared playlists and the particular way he laughed when something genuinely surprised him, and it ached in a place I thought I had already healed. I started timing my departures to avoid him. I learned his schedule. He left for work at 8:15, came home around 6:30, went for a run on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. I was not proud of this. But I also wasn't ready for what kept happening every time we stood 3 feet apart pretending we were strangers, because we were not strangers, and every part of my body knew it. Then one evening in November, something shifted. I was coming home late from a work dinner, slightly tired and carrying too many bags, and I dropped my keys in the hallway right in front of his door. I was crouching down to pick them up when his door opened and there he was, in an old gray sweater I recognized from 6 years ago, holding a cup of tea and looking at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. He said, "Do you want to come in for a minute? I just made tea." And I said, yes. Before I even thought about it. Just yes. I sat down at his kitchen table and it was the strangest feeling I have ever had in my adult life. Because everything was different apartment, different furniture, different mugs, and yet it was completely familiar in a way that made my chest hurt a little. He made tea the same way he always had. 2 minutes exactly, milk first, no sugar. I don't know why that detail hit me as hard as it did, but it did. We talked for 2 hours. Not about the divorce, not about what went wrong, not about the 14 months of silence. We talked the way we used to talk in the beginning, about work and books and a documentary he had watched that week and a funny thing that happened to me on the way home from dinner. Easy conversation, the kind that doesn't require effort because it's built on years of knowing someone. And somewhere in the middle of all of it I looked at him across the table and thought, I have missed this person. Not as my husband. Just as a person. I left around 11. He walked me to his door, 3 apartments down, and we stood there for a moment in the hallway and he said, "This was nice." And I said, "It was." And then I went inside and sat on my bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Laura called me the next morning because I had texted her at midnight, which apparently signaled an emergency. I told her what had happened and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "So what does this mean?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Do you want it to mean something?" I thought about that question for a long time. A very long time. And the honest answer, the answer I had to sit with and turn over and look at from every angle before I could trust it, was no. Not in the way she meant. What I wanted was not to go back. What I wanted was to stop losing him completely, because somewhere in the process of becoming ex-spouses we had also lost a friendship that had existed long before the marriage did, and that loss was the part that had never fully healed. I knocked on his door the following Saturday morning. He opened it looking slightly surprised and I said, "I think we should talk. Properly. About all of it." He made tea. We sat down. And for the first time since the parking lot outside the courthouse we actually talked about what had happened between us, not with anger, not with blame, but with the kind of honesty that's only possible when enough time has passed and enough healing has happened that you can look at something clearly without it destroying you. He told me things I hadn't known. I told him things I had never said out loud. We talked about where it went wrong and why neither of us had caught it earlier and what we both wished we had done differently. It was hard. There were long silences and at one point I cried, not dramatically, just quietly, the way you cry when something finally releases that you've been holding for too long. He handed me a tissue and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. We talked for almost 4 hours. And when it was over something had settled between us that I hadn't realized was still unsettled. Not resolved in the sense of fixed, you can't fix a marriage that ended, and we both knew that. But resolved in the sense of understood. Acknowledged. Laid down properly instead of just abandoned. After that things were different in the hallway. Still polite, but genuinely polite, the kind that doesn't take effort. We started having coffee occasionally on Saturday mornings, once every few weeks, nothing scheduled, just an open-door policy that we had somehow silently agreed on. He helped me move a heavy bookshelf in February. I brought him soup in March when he had a bad cold and left it outside his door with a note that said, "Milk first, no sugar." He texted me a laughing emoji and nothing else and I smiled at my phone for longer than I would like to admit. We were not getting back together. That was clear to both of us and we never pretended otherwise. The marriage had ended for real reasons and those reasons hadn't disappeared. But something else was growing in its place, something quieter and less defined but no less real. A friendship built on the ruins of something bigger, which sounds sad but actually wasn't. It was just different. A different kind of valuable. Spring came and the building put out chairs in the small courtyard at the back, and one evening in April I was sitting outside with a book when David came out with his own book and looked at me and said, "Is it weird if I sit here?" And I said, "It's a courtyard, David. You can sit wherever you want." And he laughed, that particular laugh, the one that happens when something genuinely surprises him, and sat down 2 chairs away. We read in silence for an hour. Comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. At some point the light changed and it got cooler, and he closed his book and stood up and said, "Same time next week?" And I looked up at him and said, "Sure." He went inside. I stayed a little longer, watching the last of the evening light fade over the rooftops, and I thought, this is not what I planned. This is not what either of us planned. But here we are, 3 doors apart, learning how to be something new. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.